Sorry, can you hear me now? I'm sorry. Okay. Can you hear now? Yes. Okay. Sorry. Um, I'll make sure that my microphone is turned on. Okay. So I'll go back to these introductory slides. So I was discussing society. So sociology is really the study of society. The problem for sociologists, though, is that sociologists can never really discuss society because many sociological theorists would argue that society does not really exist. Society is an abstract idea, and we don't all necessarily understand society to be the same. So if we were to say that there are no problems of poverty in Canadian society and Canada is a rich society, this is obviously not a claim that many people would make if they understood poverty or the working class. If anyone has ever been, say, unemployed or precariously housed, many would argue that there are lots of problems with housing and poverty in Canadian society. However, there are also others who would argue from the vantage point of being middle class and owning property and having a wealthy family that Canadian society does not have a lot of problems with poverty. So the production of the idea of society, the kind of truth claims that we make about Canada are really about class. And my PhD was in Marxist and neo-Marxist theory, and it was at York University. I completed my PhD at York University in Toronto, and the Department of Sociology has a strong Marxist tradition. And Marxists are really interested in the ways that class and class antagonism and one's relationship to the ruling class and to those who own the means of production, private property owners, really determines one's understanding and experience of the world. So Robert Brim discusses the 4 levels of social structure in this textbook, Sociology. And Brim argues that an important step in broadening your sociological awareness involves recognizing that 4 levels of social structure surround and permeate us. Think of these structures as concentric circles radiating out from you. So Brim is interested in the ways that society is not then just about one kind of formation. Society is about different levels of social structure that allow us to feel as though we were part of a society. And if we participate in these different social structures, we feel as though we are part of society and we are productive people in society. The first structures are microstructures. So microstructures are patterns of intimate social relations formed during face-to-face interaction. Families and friendship cliques are examples of microstructures. Mesostructures are patterns of social relations in organizations that involve people who are often not intimately acquainted and who often do not interact face-to-face. Social organizations such as colleges, government bureaucracies are examples of mesostructures. Macrostructures are overarching patterns of social relations that lie above and beyond mesostructures. One such macrostructure is patriarchy, the system of power relations, and customary practices that help to ensure male dominance in economic, political, and other spheres of life. Global structures are the 4th level of society that surrounds and permeates us. Economic relations among countries and patterns of worldwide travel and communication are examples of global structures. So this kind of sociological awareness and imagining really looks at the ways that society is organized in different ways. From a Marxist perspective, Marxist theory is conflict theory. There are other similar forms of conflict theory like feminist theory, queer theory, critical race theory. So conflict theorists are really interested in understanding inequality. So how does inequality structure these 4 levels of social structure? How does inequality determine these levels of social structure? Um, and is it possible that one's experiences of inequality can cause them to exist on the outskirts of a society or to be oppositional to social norms? Firstly, microstructures of friends and families. How do we make friends? How do we form these cliques and social groups? Who is included and who is excluded and why? Secondly, mesostructures, social organizations like the school or the church or the government. Who is included in the educational system and who is excluded and why? Um, Mesostructures like patriarchy obviously offer an example that conflict theorists would understand of this overarching system of, say, cisgender heterosexual patriarchy that has control over power relations. And is this something that we consent to? So I would argue that we don't all consent to being under patriarchal authority or rule. So this kind of social structure is actually oppressive and involves a violation of one's legal rights to refuse to be part of patriarchy. Global structures are the final level of social structure. And so global structures obviously inform economic relations. So inequality in countries in the global south will affect patterns of immigration and will perhaps determine patterns of success or inclusion among different groups of immigrants. So the caste system is one of the most extreme and I think important examples to consider, that the ways that caste and hierarchies of ethnic groups within countries like India and throughout the global south determines access to money and resources, mental health, housing. All of these kind of hierarchies of caste will perhaps also affect immigration, who can immigrate, and how they're treated when they immigrate. So social structures then allow us to think about how personal problems are never just personal, they are determined by society. So Brim is really interested in the introduction in discussing the ways that our personal lives and personal problems are not just ours alone, but are determined by social structures. So Robert Brim writes that personal problems are connected to social structures and to the micro, meso, macro, and global levels. Whether the personal problem involves finding a job, keeping a marriage intact, or acting justly to end world poverty, considering the influence of social structures on us broadens our understanding of the problems we face and suggests appropriate courses of action. So this kind of social structure, these kinds of relationships are interconnected ideas between personal problems and social structures determine our friendships and our family networks, our relationship to work, and how we attempt to solve personal problems and social problems. So the sociological imagination is discussed in the textbook, in the introduction to the textbook. And Brim draws on classical sociological thinkers like C. Wright Mills to discuss the ways that our personal lives cannot be thought to be inextricable from social structures. So we cannot abstract ourselves from society. And this is the argument that sociologists would make, that even if we think that we live apart from society, or we exist in very enclosed, say, communities like the queer community or a certain ethnic community that is very enclosed, we are still part of society. Social norms, social structures, institutions still determine the quality and character of our lives. People do not usually define the troubles they endure in terms of historical change, writes Robert Brim. Seldom aware of the intricate connection between the patterns of their own lives and the course of world history, ordinary people do not usually know what this connection means for the kind of people they are becoming and for the kind of history making in which they might take part. So Karl Marx argued that the purpose of philosophy is not just to interpret the world, it is to change it. And this possibility of changing the world, or the desire to change the world, is really about the sociological imagination. And a sociological imagination involves seeing oneself as an agent of social change, and also seeing oneself as a person who has a stake in society and whose life, whose individual personal life, will be determined by one's place in society, but also one's capacity to do work to change society. So C. Wright Mills writes, what they need is a quality of mind that will help them to see what is going on in the world and what may be happening within themselves. It is this quality that may be called the sociological imagination. So being part of the world and being part of discussions or actions that involve addressing social problems is central to the sociological imagination. One of the issues that is ongoing in Canadian society in all aspects of life is the treatment of Indigenous women and girls. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report documents cases of thousands of Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing or who were murdered under suspicious circumstances. The case of Cindy Gladue is one of many cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I will discuss the Gladue case throughout the remainder of the lecture. And I won't show graphic images, but I will talk about the details of the case, which are quite graphic. So if you feel that the descriptions or graphic descriptions of violence might trouble you, you're free to leave the class. And you will only be really tested on information from the Robert Brim book about social structures. So for example, on the forthcoming test, which will be at the end of January, you will be asked to define concepts like social structures, and you will be asked to discuss the 4 levels of social structures from the Brim textbook. And since this is an online class, you will have access to your textbook throughout the duration of the class. So the case of Cindy Gladue was in the Canadian media and has been in the Canadian media for over 10 years. Cindy Gladue, 36, was a mother of 3 children. On June 22nd, 2011, she was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room. She had bled to death from an 11-centimeter wound to her vagina. On March 18, 2015, a jury found Bradley Barton not guilty of first-degree murder. In June 2017, the Alberta Court of Appeal has overturned Barton's acquittal and ordered a new trial. The appeal court decision said there were flaws in the ways that the jury was instructed to consider sexual assault offenses and laws regarding consent. Barton's lawyer appealed, saying the appeal court's ruling is flawed. In March 2018, it was announced that the Supreme Court will review the order for a new trial. The final decision was made in August 2024 by the Supreme Court of Canada. Bradley Barton was convicted of murder, and he will not have any more appeals. So it took over 10 years for Barton to be convicted in the murder of Cindy Gladue. And the Gladue case is one of many examples of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and the kind of violence against Cindy Gladue was documented in the Canadian press. So I'll play a clip about the case of Cindy Gladue. The details of the case and the kind of trauma that was done to Cindy Gladue's body is really a national tragedy in Canada. And it is something that I think people will have to discuss in all areas of Canadian social and so I will share my screen. And I think it is important to consider Indigenous issues as being issues that determine the functioning, the proper functioning of our institutions and laws, and that also offer an example of consistent violations of the Canadian law and a refusal to uphold very basic ethical norms like the right to life in Canada. So this is a clip.
Did adult weeks instead. Think about it. Instead of laying in bed and rotting away, we literally just dead.
Look again at this picture with me. You will recognize it from years of coverage. It's Cindy Gladue, a Cree woman who was found dead in June of 2011 in an Edmonton hotel room. She was 36. And what a long journey it has been since that time for her family. 10 years nearly, 2 trials, and just this past Friday, the man charged with causing her death was found guilty of manslaughter. Jorge Barrera is with me this morning. He has been speaking with Cindy Gladue's family, speaking exclusively about what they have been going through. Jorge is in Ottawa. You were right there, Jorge, with the family waiting for that verdict. Thank you for coming in, number one, to tell us about it. But as you spoke to them, as you waited with them, what was that like on Friday?
So I spent the week going to the last week of trial with Donna McLeod, Cindy Gladue's mother, and her family. And on the eve before that verdict, they invited me to spend some time with them. And we went to the home of one of Cindy Gladue's cousins. There was a fire in the backyard. There was singing. There was sharing. And it's been a 10-year wait for justice for Cindy Gladue's family. And for Donna McLeod, she has sat through pretty near every single court date. But she hasn't spoken publicly much about what it's been like for her. But here's a little bit of what she had to say about the loss of her daughter.
Never dreamed about dead girl. Never. Ever since she passed away. And I've had elders tell me that when this is all over, I'll probably start dreaming about her.
I'll have elders start dreaming. I've been told that I will start dreaming about it. That is just an extraordinary thing, but not yet because it's not over. I mean, 10 years, 2 trials. Jorge, there is a long and very complicated process to this story here.
Yes, Cindy Gladue was found dead in a bathtub in an Edmonton hotel on June 22nd, 2011. And during that first trial against the man accused of killing her, Bradley Barton, the Crown and the defense repeatedly referred to Cindy Gladue as the Native Lady. And also in a courtroom first in Canada, they actually brought in Cindy Gladue's pelvis as evidence. It was projected into the courtroom from an adjacent room. So Alberta's then chief medical examiner could explain his testimony for the jury. Even so, the jury still came back with a not guilty verdict against Bradley Barton on a charge of first-degree murder and manslaughter. And this sparked outrage. There was protests across the country, and the case was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, which ordered a new manslaughter trial. And the High Court said that the trial judge, made a fatal error of law in explaining consent to the jury in his instructions. That second manslaughter trial began in January, and when that guilty verdict was read out on Friday, Donna McLeod broke down crying. And here's a little bit of what she had to say after she walked out of that courtroom moments after that verdict.
Feeling happy. Justice took how many years for this? Okay, now it's all over, and I'm thankful. It's over. And my daughter, she was a daughter, she was a mom, a grandmother. Now it's over. Everybody's happy now.
Now, this verdict is only one stop along what is and will continue to be a very long road of healing for Cindy Gladju's family. Heather?
But indeed, to hear her say it's over after those many, many years and some of the things that she had to endure in listening to those trials. You've been bringing us, Jorge, incredible reporting on Indigenous stories for many years. That relationship that you cultivated with the family over that week, what was this like to cover from a personal standpoint?
Well, it was moving. Before we went out to the fire, the family invited me to sit in a sharing circle. And as that stone passed from hand to hand, an image of Cindy Gladju developed from the memories from her daughter, her mother, and her cousins. But there was not only sadness with these memories, there was also laughter. And for a moment, you could catch a glimpse of the chasm that Cindy Gladju's loss left for this family. Heather?
Jorge, thank you so much. Appreciate this. Our conversation, Jorge Barrera in Ottawa. And if you want to watch more, the full video of the report he has done, it's up on our website for you this morning, cbcnews.ca.
Hello guys, so I just wanted to come in here and talk to you guys about BetterHelp. I know therapy can be such a taboo subject, and also a lot of people aren't able to afford.
So that is a clip about the case of Cindy Gladue, and the case raises a lot of ethical questions regarding the treatment of sex workers, and also regarding the treatment of women and Indigenous peoples overall. So the case of Cindy Gladue also offers us a chance to think about colonization and the relationship between colonization, settler colonialism, and violence against women in Canada. Catherine Morton has written this book chapter, and in Morton's book chapter, she argues that images of addiction and mental health and of trashed or wasted bodies is central to class antagonism against Indigenous peoples. And this use of images of Indigenous women and girls who are victims of sexual and physical violence that blames victims for the trauma inflicted onto them is, I think, central to colonization. It is also central to Canadian patriarchy. Canada has a really lucrative alcohol and tobacco industry that supports the Canadian economy, including the Canadian healthcare system. So the kind of use of certain tropes of women who drank alcohol or go out at night is a really kind of menacing form of sexism that blames victims rather than perpetrators of crime. So Morton argues that ugliness and the kind of use of images that degrade the overall image of indigeneity is central to normalizing violence against Indigenous women and girls, and it is also a central way that colonization is justified. So ugliness, writes Morton, is deployed in order to bolster the us versus them, colonizer versus colonized, civilized versus savage binaries that are inherent to the ongoing colonial project. So it is important to note that Morton is not really discussing beauty or sexual desire. She is discussing a set of norms that produce the normative body as the perfect body. And this kind of this production of the perfect body is really about eugenics. Eugenics is a way of controlling reproduction. It is a way of controlling who has children with who. It is a way of controlling citizenship and future populations. So in its most extreme formation, eugenics can be used to propagate Nazism and fascism. You can actively degrade the image of an ethnic minority in order to promote the reproductive capacity and the economic earnings of an ethnic majority. And many have argued that this kind of eugenic philosophy is actually central to Canadian nation building and to the invisibility of discrimination against Indigenous peoples, or the normalization of Indigenous peoples' oppression. So Catherine Morton states that ugliness allows for the maintenance of colonial power inequality by unequivocally naming Indigenous women as lesser than. What would it mean to move past a politics of ugliness in regard to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women? So the invisibility of whiteness and white privilege and white supremacy also allows for Indigenous people to appear to be strange on their own land. Sarah Ahmed argues that whiteness gains its currency by going unnoticed. And Ahmed asks, if this is true, then what would it mean to notice whiteness? So when you have a privilege, you often have a privilege to the extent that nobody names your privilege as being a privilege. So if you are able-bodied, and one of the ways that you end up having a middle-class income and career and being successful is because you are able-bodied. This norm is not really ever called into question. It's rare that people who are able-bodied are kind of told that one of the reasons that they have any success is because of their privilege and not necessarily because of what is earned. This is also true of race and whiteness, that whiteness also gains its currency by going unnoticed. What this also means is that when you have a privilege, you yourself might be unaware of the way that it works. So every day that you wake up as an able-bodied person, and I'm an able-bodied person, so every day when I wake up and I find it easy to walk around, to walk up and down stairs, to walk through doors, to go on public transportation, to navigate a city, to travel freely, then I'm not necessarily someone who has to think about these things every day. If I was a person with a disability, I would have to think about how difficult it is to walk up and down stairs, how difficult it is to even move physically in space, to access a building at a university. But when you have privilege, you don't have to really think about these things. The privileges of whiteness and race also allow one to access certain spaces without constantly thinking that your citizenship will be called into question, that you will be asked to show ID over and over again, that your English language skills will be called into question, even if you are a native English language speaker. One's relationship to capitalism could always be called into question, that if you buy things, someone could question why you have enough money to buy these things, if the credit cards you're using are your own, if the house that you live in is actually your own home. So these privileges of being a settler are often really stark examples of how we as settlers are never really called into question. Our privileges as settlers, our entitlements as settlers are often not questioned. What would it mean to radically reconfigure the public discourse of missing and murdered Indigenous women away from naming them as unattractive, undesirable, and therefore bodies that can be allowed to disappear? And Catherine Morton writes, this chapter grapples with these questions and unpacks how the politics of ugliness are interwoven with settler colonial racist, sexist, classist understandings of Indigenous women's experiences, particularly of violence. So for Morton, as a feminist writer, Catherine Morton obviously does not believe in her chapter that there are quote unquote ugly people as opposed to quote unquote beautiful people. These are constructions of bodies that allow violence to be inflicted onto certain bodies. So the obvious example from the feminist movement would be degrading victims of sexual violence, referring to victims of rape and sexual harassment as addicts or as party girls, as people who are deserving of violence. And this is something that has happened over and over again throughout history in North America, and has often been central to North American patriarchy. So telling stories about victims of rape as being quote unquote bad women is a way of justifying rape. And this kind of construction of innocence and beauty as being associated with class position, whiteness, Christianity, is a really colonial narrative. So as mentioned, during the first trial, the judge and lawyers referred to Cindy Gladue as a prostitute or sex worker over 50 times. She was not referred to as human being or honored as a mother, daughter, or friend of the many that mourn her passing. This disgusted Indigenous and women's rights leaders. Thousands of people show up in protest across the country to condemn this treatment of Cindy. So we can return to this discussion of society. What constitutes society and social norms? The four levels of social structure connect our intimate lives to our relationship to work, capital, and the world. Is sex work something that we all think of in the same way? There are many who would argue that in a time when people use Grindr and Tinder to access sex all of the time, quite easily within a minute, or within less than a minute, if you look at apps like Grindr, which is a gay male dating app, I mean, people can access sex very quickly. The terms in which people access sex might involve money. So if you go on a date with somebody, they might buy you something. Is this sex work? Is it criminal behavior? If you go on a date with someone and it is implied that they are going to buy you things and that you might then have some sort of conjugal relations, romantic relations, then are you a criminal? Obviously, our norms would say no, that middle class people can date each other. But when people engage in sex work, why did they become criminal? And who really becomes a criminal and who really dies when they engage in sex work? What researchers have argued is that it is often Black, Indigenous, and women of color and migrant women and transgender women who are most likely to be victims of violence because of sexual relationships. So this kind of constant use of terms like prostitute over and over again justify crimes against sex workers, but they also justify crimes against anyone who is seen to be precarious and whose sexual relationships are already thought to be questionable. So transgender women are also often killed at very high rates. And one of the reasons that transgender women, specifically transgender women of color in the Americas, are often thought to be at risk is because of sex work. But I would argue that it is not really because of sex work. It is because of forms of discrimination that make one's behavior look very different from another person. So drugs are another example in Canada. It is quite common for people, I think, to do drugs or to engage in recreational drug use, or it is not necessarily common, but it's common for people to have the capacity to do this. So if you look statistically throughout the course of your life in Canada, it would be normal for you to hear about drug use or hear about smoking of marijuana or to know that you have access to this, particularly as a teenager or as a student. It is up to you as to whether you use these things. And in Canada, the legalization of marijuana is really a way of regulating an unregulated industry. The problem with unregulated industries is that it is the most precarious people who are more likely to die. So while drug use is, say, common, or it's common for people to know that they can access drugs in the same way that people drinking alcohol is common, or accessing, or the capacity to access alcohol is normal. It is most likely that people who die because of their involvement in the drug trade are most likely working class people, poor people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So regulating these industries is also a way of protecting the most marginalized people. So Morton argues that in the public discourse of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, ugliness has acted as an essential descriptor. And this ugliness is constructed in damaged bodies, diseased bodies, those bodies that are wasted from substance abuse. So this idea, the construction of the quote-unquote sex worker or prostitute, creates a division, and it is a class-based division between middle-class people who often use dating apps or who engage in certain processes to access sex. And these processes, like the use of Grindr and Tinder, are normalized, whereas sex work is not. And I think that class antagonism often determines why certain people's behavior is seen to be suspicious or criminal and other people's behavior is normalized. So Morton again comes back to this idea of ugliness and of demeaning and derogatory images of Indigenous women and girls in the media. Morton states that ugliness allows for the violence of these cases to become inevitable and naturalized. More sinister still, ugliness diminishes or at least neutralizes violence, both chronic and acute, faced by Indigenous women. What value is there in naming a missing Indigenous woman as a drug-addicted sex worker, other than to construct her victimhood as not only ugly and shocking, but unavoidable? So Morton discusses the ways that the camera angles and the use of mug shots after Indigenous women and girls dies is one way in which colonial genocide is naturalized and almost thought to be inevitable. And Morton discusses how the photos that are often used after Indigenous women and girls die are often photos that imply, subtly or not so subtly, that Indigenous women and girls are criminals and involved in crime. So again, the image that was used of Cindy Gladue over and over again implies deviance. The use of the image of Gladue with a cigarette, I think, implies a deviation from certain norms of femininity. And this deviance then places blame on victims of crime rather than perpetrators. Dominant perceptions of ugliness seep into the messaging around missing and murdered Indigenous women, writes Catherine Morton. In Coracle, Brown, and Wilkes' research on constructions of Indigenous peoples and issues in mainstream media, the consideration of camera angle, photograph content, and poses are taken into account. The ugly victim within the images of the visual discourse loses individual identity and is disempowered. Coracle, Brown, and Wilkes find camera angles in the colonial gaze, rendering the Indigenous person being photographed and their relative size to be important visual cues that establish the power of or powerlessness being communicated through the image. These very subtle decisions in composition are important cues that establish the trope of the ugly victim. These composition choices, although subtle, cultivate a sense of wretchedness that is critical in the perception of ugliness. Dependency and helplessness are immediately recognized as ugly or undesirable behaviors. So what I would argue is that this kind of construction of the ugly and the condemned, as opposed to the beautiful and the privileged, is really, as Robert Brim suggests, part of a sociological imagination that connects personal identities to broader social structures. In the 1990s, neoliberalism became a normal part of our everyday social order, of our social order. So neoliberalism involves neoliberalism, new forms of liberalism, and liberalism refers to free market capitalism, a liberal attitudes towards, or a series of liberal attitudes that allow us to sell our labor at any time on the internet, in all areas of work, and also allows for liberal attitudes towards consumerism. So you can also buy things in a neoliberal landscape. These new forms of liberalism or market-based liberalism give rise to the cult of the individual, an individual person who can sell their labor as a brand image on the internet, can also buy things at all times. The problem is that neoliberalism also corresponds to the dissolution of the social welfare state. The social welfare state would have once protected or cared for people. Now we are all made to compete and sell ourselves and sell our labor at all times. The problem is that if one is in need of care, they are actually seen to be an annoyance or a problem. So requiring care from others becomes a problem. And the construction of Indigenous peoples as those who ask for care or support is actually, I think, within the context of neoliberalism, vulnerability becomes pathological and something that we actually often see as negative. So commentators discuss the ways that indifference often frames our responses to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and many authors argue that this sense of indifference must stop in order for Canada to uphold its human rights laws. So in the interest of time, I will finish there, and I will send you the Robert Brim textbook over messages in PDF format. In the tests, if you were asked to define social structures and the 4 levels of, say, social structure, you can cite different editions of the textbook. You can also cite this lecture as well. So that is all. Thank you very much for your participation. On Thursday, I will leave more room for discussion and time for discussion. I will send you the syllabus and the readings over messages in case you have trouble finding them on Blackboard. And I will also send you the assignments and tests when they arise at the end of January. And the first test is not until the end of January, so there are still a few more weeks before the test. But it will essentially be an open book test. So thank you very much for your participation in the class, and that is all for this class, and we will meet again on Thursday. And please email me if you have any questions, and yes, you're welcome to use different editions of the Brim book as well. Thank you. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to meeting you on Thursday. Goodbye.